I was splitting firewood behind my cabin when I heard the sirens coming up the mountain road. 2 sheriff's cruisers, lights flashing, kicking up dust clouds as they wound their way through the pine trees toward my property. Behind them came a black Mercedes SUV that I recognized immediately. Rebecca Thornton, president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA and the biggest pain in my ass for the past 6 months. The first deputy out of his car was young, looked nervous, kept checking his notepad like he wasn't sure why he was there. The second deputy was older, more experienced, and had the expression of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. Rebecca climbed out of her Mercedes wearing a designer hiking outfit that probably cost more than most people make in a month. She marched over to the deputies like she was leading a military operation. "Officers, that's the structure I was telling you about. Completely illegal, no permits, violating about 17 different building codes." She pointed at my cabin like it was some kind of criminal hideout. The older deputy, his name tag said Martinez, walked over to me. "Sir, we got a complaint about an illegal structure on this property. You mind if we take a look around?" I set down my axe and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Deputy Martinez, you're welcome to look at whatever you want. But first, can I ask who filed the complaint?" Rebecca stepped forward before Martinez could answer. "I did. As president of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, I have a responsibility to ensure all structures in our community meet proper standards." I looked at her, then at the deputies, then back at her. "Rebecca, what exactly makes you think your HOA has jurisdiction over my property? This entire valley is part of the Willow Creek community. Your cabin is an eyesore that violates our architectural standards." That's when I started laughing. Not a chuckle, a deep belly laugh that echoed off the mountains surrounding us. "Ma'am," Deputy Martinez said to Rebecca, "do you have documentation showing this property is subject to HOA regulations?" Rebecca pulled out a folder thick with papers. "Right here. Community bylaws, architectural guidelines, enforcement procedures. This structure violates at least a dozen regulations." Martinez looked through the papers, then looked at me. "Sir, do you have any documentation regarding your property ownership?" "Deputy, I sure do. But first, let me ask Rebecca a question." I turned to face the HOA president. "Rebecca, do you know who owns this valley?" "The community owns it collectively, managed through the HOA. "And who do you think sold the lots to build your fancy Willow Creek Estates?" Her confidence faltered just a bit. The development company. Willow Creek Development Corporation." "And where do you think Willow Creek Development Corporation got the land?" Now she looked uncertain. I assumed they purchased it from the previous owners." I nodded. "They did. They purchased it from me. All 2,847 acres of it." The silence that followed was so complete you could hear the wind rustling through the pine trees. "That's impossible," Rebecca said. "You live in a cabin. You can't possibly own the entire valley. Deputy Martinez, would you like to see my deed?" I walked into my cabin and came back with a leather portfolio that contained the original land grant documents, survey maps, and property deeds dating back to 1952 when my grandfather first purchased the valley. Martinez studied the papers carefully, checking the legal descriptions against his GPS unit. The younger deputy looked over his shoulder, shaking his head in disbelief. "Ma'am," Martinez said to Rebecca, "according to these documents, Mr. Hartwell owns not just this parcel, but the entire valley, including all the land that Willow Creek Estates is built on." Rebecca's face went white. "That can't be right." "It's right," I said. "Let me explain how this works, Rebecca. In 1998, I needed cash to pay for my daughter's cancer treatments. I sold 85% of my valley to Willow Creek Development Corporation with a specific clause in the contract." I pulled out another document. The development company could build houses and sell lots, but they could never sell the underlying land ownership. They could only sell 99-year leases. "What does that mean?" the younger deputy asked. "It means every house in Willow Creek Estates is built on land that I still own. The homeowners have long-term leases, but I retain ownership of the underlying property." Rebecca was reading over Martinez's shoulder, her face getting redder by the minute. "This is ridiculous. We bought our houses. We own our properties." "Rebecca, you own your house. But the land it sits on? That's mine. And it has been for the past 25 years. I pointed to a specific clause in the development contract. "Furthermore, as the underlying landowner, I retain authority over all land use decisions that aren't explicitly covered in the individual lease agreements." "What kind of authority?" Martinez asked. "Well, for example, if someone filed false complaints about illegal structures on my property, I'd have the right to terminate their lease and evict them from my land. The blood drained from Rebecca's face completely. You can't do that. We have rights. We paid for our houses. You have whatever rights your lease agreement gives you. And one of the clauses in every lease prohibits harassment of the landowner. I pulled out my phone and showed them photos I'd taken over the past 6 months. Rebecca trampling through my garden to inspect my cabin. Rebecca measuring my deck to see if it was too large for community standards. Rebecca posting signs on my property declaring it non-compliant. Deputy Martinez, Rebecca Thornton has been trespassing on my property for months, claiming she has HOA authority over land that she doesn't own. Martinez looked at the photos, then at Rebecca. Ma'am, is this you in these pictures? I was conducting legitimate HOA inspections. On property that isn't subject to your HOA? I thought it was. Ma'am, ignorance of property law isn't a defense for trespassing. But I wasn't done with my story. Rebecca, there's something else you should know. When I sold to the development company, I kept mineral rights, water rights, and access rights for the entire valley. What does that mean? She asked weakly. It means I own the well that supplies water to your subdivision. I own the access road that leads to your neighborhood. And I own the gravel quarry where the county gets materials to maintain your roads. The silence stretched out for a long time. How is that possible? Martinez asked. Deputy, 25 years ago, I was a successful mining engineer with a sick daughter and medical bills piling up. I needed cash fast, but I wasn't stupid. I sold the development rights but kept the underlying assets. I pointed toward the cluster of expensive houses visible in the distance. Every month, Willow Creek Estates pays me lease fees for the water system, road access, and land use. Rebecca's been trying to control my cabin while living on property I own and using utilities I control. Rebecca was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Why didn't anyone tell me this? Because you never asked. You just assumed you could boss around the guy in the cabin without understanding who you were dealing with. Deputy Martinez was shaking his head. So let me get this straight. Miss Thornton called us to report an illegal structure on property that you own, while she lives on property that you also own. That's correct. And she's been trespassing on your property for months under the false belief that her HOA has authority over your land? Also correct. Martinez turned to Rebecca. Ma'am, you want to explain to me how you thought this was going to work? Rebecca opened and closed her mouth several times without making a sound. I said, Rebecca assumed that because I live in a cabin instead of a mansion, I must be some kind of squatter or vagrant who could be intimidated into compliance. Is that accurate, ma'am? Martinez asked. Rebecca's voice was barely a whisper. I just wanted to maintain community standards. Whose community? My land. She didn't answer. Martinez closed his notepad. Mr. Hartwell, do you want to press charges for trespassing? I thought about it for a minute. Rebecca looked like she was about to faint. The younger deputy was trying not to smile. The whole situation was pretty ridiculous. Not today, deputy. But I do want this incident documented. And I want Miss Thornton to understand that any future trespassing on my property will result in immediate eviction from my land. Eviction? Rebecca found her voice again. You can't evict me. I own my house. Rebecca, read your lease agreement. Specifically the section about landowner relations and harassment policies. Martinez handed me his business card. Mr. Hartwell, if you have any more problems, give us a call. After the deputies left, Rebecca stood by her Mercedes, still holding her folder of HOA regulations, looking like her entire world had collapsed. This isn't over, she said finally. Actually, Rebecca, it is. But let me give you some free advice. Go home, read your lease agreement very carefully, and maybe consider resigning from the HOA board before you cause more problems for your neighbors. You can't tell me what to do. I can't tell you what to do in your house. But I can absolutely tell you what you can't do on my land. And you can't harass me, trespass on my property, or file false complaints with law enforcement. She drove away without another word, leaving a cloud of dust and the faint smell of expensive perfume. But Rebecca Thornton wasn't the type to give up easily. 3 days later, I got a certified letter from a law firm in the city. Rebecca had hired an attorney to challenge my land ownership claims and demand that I submit to HOA authority. The letter was full of legal jargon and threats, but the basic message was clear. Submit to the HOA or face a lawsuit. I called my own attorney, a guy named Frank Morrison who'd handled the original land sale to the development company. Frank, you remember the Willow Creek deal from '98? Of course. One of the most complex land transactions I've ever handled. Why? I explained Rebecca's harassment campaign and the legal threat. Frank was quiet for a long time. Tom, this woman has no idea what she's stepping into. The lease agreements are ironclad. Every homeowner in that subdivision signed documents acknowledging your underlying land ownership. So what do? We respond with overwhelming force. I'm going to send a letter to her attorney explaining exactly what your property rights are and what happens if she continues this harassment. What happens? Immediate lease termination and eviction. Plus, since you control the water and access rights, we can make life very uncomfortable for anyone who violates the landowner harassment clause. Frank's letter went out the next day. It included copies of all the original land sale documents, the development agreements, and the individual lease contracts that every Willow Creek Estates homeowner had signed. The key paragraph read, Ms. Thornton's continued harassment of the landowner constitutes a material breach of her lease agreement. Further violations will result in immediate lease termination and removal from the property. Rebecca's attorney responded within a week. They were withdrawing all legal challenges and advised their client to cease all contact with me. But Rebecca wasn't done yet. A week later, I woke up to find survey stakes all around my cabin. Someone had been on my property during the night, marking boundaries and measuring distances. I called the surveyor's office whose name was on the stakes. This is Tom Hartwell. Someone put survey stakes on my property without permission. I want to know who hired you. Let me check. That was ordered by Rebecca Thornton. She said she needed a property survey for HOA compliance purposes. She hired you to survey property she doesn't own for an HOA that has no jurisdiction here? I'm not sure I understand. I spent 20 minutes explaining the situation to the surveyor. By the end of the call, he was apologizing profusely and agreeing to remove the stakes immediately. But the surveying incident told me something important. Rebecca was escalating her harassment campaign, probably hoping to find some legal technicality that would give her control over my property. Time to end this permanently. I called Frank Morrison again. Frank, I want to exercise my rights under the lease agreements. Specifically, the landowner protection clause. Which tenants? Just one. Rebecca Thornton. She's violated the harassment provisions multiple times, and she just hired surveyors to trespass on my property. Tom, you realize that if we terminate her lease, she'll lose her house? Frank, she's been trying to steal my property for months using fake HOA authority. I tried being reasonable. Time for consequences. Frank filed the lease termination notice the next morning. Under the terms of Rebecca's agreement, she had 30 days to cure the violations or vacate the property. The notice was delivered by a process server, along with copies of all the documentation showing her repeated trespassing and harassment. Rebecca's response was predictable. She called an emergency HOA meeting and tried to rally the other homeowners to fight the eviction. That's when she learned something interesting about her neighbors. Most of the Willow Creek Estates residents were successful professionals who'd read their contracts carefully before buying. They knew about the underlying land ownership structure, and they were horrified that Rebecca had been jeopardizing their community relationship with the landowner. Frank Morrison attended the HOA meeting to explain the legal situation. Ladies and gentlemen, when you purchased your homes, you signed lease agreements acknowledging Mr. Hartwell's ownership of the underlying land. Those agreements include specific provisions about landowner relations. He read the relevant clauses aloud. No harassment of the landowner. No interference with landowner property rights. No false claims of authority over landowner property. Ms. Thornton has violated all of these provisions repeatedly. Mr. Hartwell has the right to terminate her lease and require her to vacate the property. One of the homeowners raised his hand. What about the rest of us? Are our leases at risk? Not unless you start harassing Mr. Hartwell or trespassing on his property. He's been an excellent landowner for 25 years. This action is specifically about Ms. Thornton's behavior. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove Rebecca as president and issued a formal apology to me for her actions. But Rebecca still had 2 weeks left on her 30-day notice, and she wasn't going quietly. She hired a new attorney, filed for an injunction to stop the eviction, and started a media campaign claiming she was being victimized by a land baron who was trying to steal her home. The local newspaper ran a story with the headline, HOA President Faces Eviction in Land Dispute. But when the reporter actually investigated the story, the narrative changed quickly. The follow-up article ran 3 days later. Landowner fights back against HOA harassment. President's eviction based on contract violations. The story included interviews with other homeowners who described Rebecca's increasingly erratic behavior and her obsession with controlling my property. She was convinced that the guy in the cabin was some kind of squatter, one neighbor told the reporter. She had no idea he owns the entire valley. Rebecca's injunction was denied. The judge ruled that the lease agreements were valid, the violations were documented, and the eviction was legally justified. With 5 days left on her notice, Rebecca finally accepted reality. She listed her house for sale and began making arrangements to move. But she had one last card to play. 3 days before her eviction deadline, Rebecca called the county building department and filed a complaint claiming my cabin was built without permits and posed a safety hazard to the community. A building inspector showed up the next morning. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Inspector Davis from the county. We got a complaint about unpermitted construction on your property." I invited him in and showed him my filing cabinet full of permits, inspections, and certificates dating back to 1987 when my grandfather had built the cabin. "Sir, your documentation is more complete than most commercial buildings. Every addition, every modification, every repair has been properly permitted and inspected. Inspector, the woman who filed this complaint is being evicted for harassment. This is just her last attempt to cause trouble." Inspector Davis spent 2 hours going through my cabin with a fine-tooth comb. He checked electrical systems, plumbing, structural integrity, and compliance with current building codes. "Mr. Hartwell, this is one of the best-maintained properties I've inspected. Whoever filed this complaint was either misinformed or deliberately wasting county resources." He filed a report clearing my property of all violations and noting that the complaint appeared to be retaliatory in nature. Rebecca moved out 2 days later. Her house sold within a month to a young couple who introduced themselves to me as soon as they moved in. They were respectful, friendly, and had no interest in telling me how to manage my property. The new HOA president, a retired teacher named Margaret Santos, called me to formally apologize for Rebecca's behavior and to establish a positive relationship going forward. "Mr. Hartwell, we want you to know that the community appreciates everything you've done to maintain this valley. We're committed to being good tenants." "Margaret, I appreciate that. I've never had problems with any of your neighbors." Rebecca was an anomaly. 6 months later, life in the valley had returned to normal. The HOA focused on community events and maintenance issues instead of trying to control property they didn't own. I still live in my cabin, still split my own firewood, and still enjoy the peace and quiet of the mountains. The difference is that now everyone understands who owns what and who has authority over what. Rebecca learned that you can't Karen your way out of a legally binding contract. She assumed that because I lived simply, I must be powerless. She was wrong. Sometimes the guy in the cabin owns the whole valley. And sometimes when you call the cops on him, you discover that you're living on his land at his pleasure. Rebecca tried to use fake authority to control my property. Instead, she lost her home and learned a very expensive lesson about property law. The view from my porch is still beautiful. The mountains are still peaceful. And my valley is still mine just like it's been for 70 years. Some things never change. Including the fact that bullies eventually meet someone who won't be bullied. Rebecca found that out the hard way when she discovered that the man she was trying to evict actually owned her house.